In the freezing winter of 1910, an Italian father stepped off the boat at Ellis Island with nothing but a cardboard suitcase, a pocket full of memories, and a family to feed. He moved them straight into a cramped brick tenement room on Mulberry Street in New York City. He had no modern heater, no steady job, no government safety net. The American winter entered through the uninsulated brick, through their wet boots, and through their very breath. They carried their old world habits. They waited in the dark, they endured. But what saved this family from breaking during that brutal first season was not a sudden stroke of financial fortune. It was not a loan from a bank. It was a hidden system of survival, a code passed down through generations of rural hardship that modern America has completely forgotten. Today, massive corporations spend billions of dollars teaching us to be helpless, so we keep paying their monthly utility bills. But our grandparents knew better. Number 1 on this list allowed them to stay warm using zero electricity. Number 3 turned a few pieces of stale bread into a feast of human dignity. And number 7 built an entire safety net without a single green dollar bill. Let us count down the 10 forgotten strategies Italian immigrant families used to survive their very first winter in America. Number 1. The shared warmth room. A newly arrived family from Sicily with 8 young children moved into a tiny apartment in the north end of Boston. The brick building trapped the noise and the smoke, but it completely failed to trap the heat. When the freezing January winds started rattling the thin windows, the family did not complain about a lack of personal space. Instead, they made themselves physically smaller. They abandoned the colder corners of the flat and packed all 10 members of the household, along with 2 boarders from their old village, into the single room right next to the kitchen stove. At night, mattresses touched on the floor. Children slept sideways, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the exact same thin blankets. The adults curled up against the cold walls to act as human insulation. It was crowded. It was uncomfortable. But they understood that body heat is a resource. Today, we pay hundreds of dollars every single month to heat giant, empty suburban houses with rooms we do not even step into for weeks. We trade our financial freedom for isolated comfort. The modern housing industry spent decades convincing us that everyone needs their own separate bedroom, driving us deeper into debt and loneliness. But to the immigrants, privacy was a luxury they postponed for better days. Warmth could not be postponed. The crowded floor was not a sign of defeat. It was a strategy for survival. Number 2, the fireplace piecework. A Neapolitan mother named Lucia lived in a drafty tenement apartment in Greenwich Village. The freezing winter winds turned the building hallways into ice boxes. She did not just sit idly by the stove waiting for her husband to bring home his meager wages. Instead, she brought the factory right into her own kitchen. Lucia and her 7-year-old daughter sat on wooden crates underneath a single dim oil lamp, working late into the night. They took in what the city called piecework, assembling artificial silk flowers for local hat manufacturers or sewing garment linings by hand. Every member of the family, even the youngest children, was mobilized to help sort materials, pack the fabric, or count the finished goods. They worked through the bitter cold because every single completed flower meant a fraction of a cent. By the end of a long, exhausting week, their combined family effort brought in an extra $1 or $2, which was exactly the amount needed to buy an extra bag of coal to keep their stove burning through the weekend. Today, we live in a world of passive consumption, where giant corporations manufacture our clothing thousands of miles away in automated factories, and we discard garments the moment a single thread pulls loose. The modern corporate fashion industry spent decades teaching us to buy rather than mend, making us completely dependent on retail supply chains. But, to the immigrants, a broken item was not trash. It was simply unfinished labor. Every spare minute spent sewing by the fire was a deliberate defense against poverty. The needle was not a sign of misery. It was an anchor of autonomy. Number 3, the kitchen of the poor. A heavy laborer named Giovanni walked into a small, humid basement kitchen in Little Italy after spending 12 hours clearing frozen soil on a construction site. His hands were cracked, his boots were soaked through, and his stomach was completely empty. He had only 15 cents left in his pocket. He sat down at a rough wooden table where a woman known to the neighborhood as Mama Bertolotti was serving dinner. For those 15 cents, she handed him a massive steaming bowl of thick minestrone soup, a crust of bread, and a small glass of house wine. Mama Bertolotti practiced what Italians call cucina povera, the cuisine of the poor. Immigrant mothers did not have the money for expensive cuts of meat or fancy ingredients during the winter months. Instead, they leaned heavily into dense, filling staples like cornmeal for polenta, lentils, potatoes, and cheap winter cabbage. They would take old bread heels that were hard as rock, soak them directly into vegetable broth thickened with a little lard or oil, and turn kitchen scraps into a meal that could sustain a grown man through a blizzard. 1 pound of dried beans cost almost nothing, but after soaking in water overnight, it expanded into 2.5 pounds of pure, dense nourishment. It was strategic eating. Today, high-end metropolitan restaurants sell artisanal bread puddings and organic bone broths for $30 a bowl, rebranding the basic survival habits of our ancestors as a premium luxury lifestyle trend. The modern industrial food complex has filled our supermarkets with expensive processed microwave meals that leave our bodies weak and our bank accounts empty. But our grandmothers knew that true nutrition comes from patience and resourcefulness. They did not need a corporate label to tell them how to feed a family with dignity. The soup pot was not just dinner, it was an economic system. Number 4, the sacred iron burner. A Sicilian foundry worker in Chicago walked through the frozen streets, carrying a heavy sack of broken wooden crates and packing boards he salvaged from the factory yard. At home, his family did not have a modern radiator or a thermostat on the wall. Everything they had, and everything they were, revolved around a single black cast iron stove sitting in the middle of the kitchen. During the bitter winter months, the family organized their entire lives around this small flame. The mother cooked the morning polenta there, dried the wet wool socks over the iron rim, and kept a heavy pot of water steaming to cut the dry, freezing air. When coal became too expensive, the father stretched every single ember by feeding the fire with workshop leftovers and wood scraps. Sometimes, thick smoke filled the narrow room. Sometimes, dark soot blackened their lungs. But they stayed close. They endured the dirt because that iron box saved them 40 cents a day on heating fuel, a massive sum that kept the landlord from throwing them out onto the street. Today, we live in houses with invisible central heating, adjusting a digital screen without ever seeing the fire that keeps us alive. We are warm, but we are completely disconnected from the resource. The utility corporation spent decades convincing us that total convenience is safety, making us dependent on a grid we do not control. But our grandparents knew that warmth was something you had to build, tend, and protect with your own 2 hands. The stove was not a piece of furniture. It was life itself. Number 5, the newspaper lining. A Neapolitan tailor's family in Philadelphia stepped out into the blinding morning snowstorm. They had arrived in America with clothing designed for Mediterranean weather, thin wool jackets, light cotton shawls, and worn-out leather shoes that offered absolutely no protection against the fierce northern winds. They could not afford the heavy, expensive winter coats sold in the downtown department stores, so they engineered their own insulation. Every morning before the children walked to school, the mother would layer shirts under shirts and scarves over scarves. She would take sheets of yesterday's daily newspaper and wrap them tightly around the children's chests and legs, underneath their patched coats. The thick layers of newsprint acted as a barrier, trapping their natural body heat and blocking the freezing drafts from slicing through the thin fabric. This simple, free technique protected the father during his 12-hour shifts outside on the railroad tracks, saving the family $30 that winter on heavy garments. Years later, a famous study by sociologists at Yale University examined these early immigrant neighborhoods. They discovered that these Italian families managed to save a higher percentage of their wages than almost any other group in American history, even though they started with the lowest paying jobs. You see, to our grandparents, saving was not an afterthought. It was not a restriction you put on yourself when times got tough. It was the core infrastructure of the household. They built financial freedom out of thin air, 1 penny at a time, because they refused to let a bank or a landlord control their destiny. They sacrificed temporary comfort to buy permanent security. Number 6, the shift mattress. A Sicilian dockworkers family in Chicago lived in a tenement where the bedroom walls froze solid during the night. They possessed only 2 real mattresses for a household of 9 people. To survive the freezing dark, they did not buy extra furniture on credit. They shared their beds. Siblings slept shoulder to shoulder, pooling their body heat under heavy quilts, patched together from old coats. But the true strategy happened when the boarders and older sons returned from their jobs. Men who worked the grueling night shifts at the rail yards would slide into the exact mattresses left warm by the family members who had just woken up for day work. The beds rotated in constant shifts. One body left, another arrived. This relentless rotation saved the family up to $12 a month by eliminating the need to rent extra space, money that went directly toward paying off their apartment loan early. Today, we live in an era where every child is told they need their own private bedroom, their own massive bed, and their own personal screen to look into at night. We have traded physical closeness for expensive isolation. Number 7. The bone bag. An Abruzzese grandmother stood over a small stove in a narrow Manhattan kitchen, holding a piece of dried cheese rind that was as hard as stone. In her household, wasting food was not just a waste. It was considered an insult to the labor that earned it. She kept a small cloth sack hanging near the window, known to the family as the bone bag. Every scrap of fat, every chicken bone left on a plate, every onion skin, and every parsley stem was dried and dropped inside. At the end of the week, those naked bones were placed into a heavy iron pot and boiled for hours to extract every hidden ounce of nutrients. She would drop the hard cheese rinds directly into the water, letting them dissolve slowly to create a rich, savory base for a massive pot of bean soup. A single 3-pound chicken was stretched across 4 separate meals, feeding 10 people until the bones themselves turned to dust. This relentless resourcefulness saved the household more than $52 a year on groceries, a fortune that protected them from eviction during the worst winter storms. Today, the average American household throws away nearly 1/3 of its food every single week, driven by arbitrary expiration dates and the illusion of cheap abundance. We discard the very pieces that hold the deepest nutrition, then go to retail stores to buy expensive synthetic bone broths and processed supplements in plastic bottles. Number 8. The community safety net. A young Italian widow named Maria lived with her 3 infants in a drafty tenement on Elizabeth Street during a record-breaking freeze. Her husband had been severely injured during a shift at the local rail yards, leaving the household with 0 weekly income and a completely empty coal bin. In a strange city where she barely spoke the language, she faced a winter that did not care about her grief. But in those days, people did not face the cold alone. The local mutual aid society, an association built by immigrants from her own home village in Calabria, stepped through her doorway, huddled together in the parish chapel of Our Lady of Pompeii. Neighbors who barely had enough for themselves collected pennies, nickels, and dimes in a worn-out coffee tin. A local baker arrived with a large sack of stale crusts, and another family sent their oldest son over with a bundle of salvaged firewood. This unofficial network kept Maria's family warm and fed for 2 brutal months without her spending a single dollar bill. Community became their real insulation. Number 9. The repair mandate. An Italian father named Pietro sat near the fading embers of his kitchen stove in Philadelphia, holding a pair of his son's work boots. The leather soles had completely split open from walking through the slushy snow, but Pietro did not open a holiday catalog or walk down to a retail store. Instead, he reached for a small scrap of discarded leather he had saved from a local workshop yard, a handful of iron nails, and a heavy needle. Pietro spent 3 hours under the weak light of an oil lamp, resoling those boots by hand, restitching the seams until they were twice as thick as before. That same evening, his wife used a piece of wire to patch a small leak in their iron cooking pot and mended a frayed wool blanket for the 3rd time that season. This absolute refusal to discard anything saved the household more than $15 over the winter months, preventing them from spending a single cent on non-essential manufactured goods. Number 10. The sacred family ritual. A Neapolitan family on Elizabeth Street sat inside a room so cold that their breath turned to mist before it even hit the walls. The father's hands were bruised from a long week at the foundry, and and the winter wind was howling outside the cracked glass. But on this Sunday evening, the outside world did not exist. Despite the bitter chill, the mother spread a clean, hand-woven white tablecloth, brought all the way from the old country across their rough wooden table. She lit a single Saint candle because electricity was a luxury they could not afford. Together, they sat down to a tiny meal of homemade pasta, stretched with nothing but garlic, a few drops of olive oil, and some preserved tomatoes saved from the previous summer. They sang songs remembered from their home villages, and the grandmother spoke to the children in her old dialect, wrapping them in a history that no American winter could ever freeze out. One single pot of simple food was divided among 12 people, but nobody left the table hungry. Today, we live in a world of automated convenience, where family members grab fast food bags and eat alone in the dark, staring into the cold blue light of a smartphone screen. We have abundance, but we have lost our connection. The industrial lifestyle spent decades breaking down the sacred bond of the family table, turning dinner into a lonely, commercial transaction. But our ancestors understood that when the world outside is cold and indifferent, a family ritual is the only thing that keeps your heart from freezing solid. The small plate of pasta was not a shortage of food. It was a feast of human dignity. Think about the story of the second-generation son, Tony Rossi. He grew up watching his parents stretch every single dollar bill behind the plaster walls of that Mulberry Street tenement. Tony worked hard, went to school, and eventually bought a massive suburban home with automated climate control and a multi-car garage. He made 10 times more money than his father ever dreamed of, but Tony lived in constant quiet anxiety. He was trapped in a 30-year mortgage, buried under credit card debt, and he did not even know the first name of the human being living right next door to him. He had total comfort, but he had zero freedom. He had forgotten the code that made his family strong in the first place. The first winter in America did not greet these immigrant families with open arms. The snow fell on the crowded tenements with the exact same freezing weight, but these 10 survival strategies were not the desperate random tricks of poor people. They were a beautifully designed system. A system built on the absolute refusal to be broken by a hard world. They shrank their rooms, they stretched their soup, they layered their clothes, and they mended their own boots. They trusted their neighbors, and they protected their rituals. They stayed. Our grandparents and great-grandparents knew how to stand tall and maintain their dignity with absolutely nothing in their pockets. We inherited their blood, but we forgot their wisdom. We let modern convenience turn into an expensive dependence. But that knowledge is not entirely gone. It is still waiting inside your family tree. This week, I challenge you to take back one small piece of your autonomy. Turn down your digital thermostat by just 2 degrees and feel the actual weight of the season. Cook a slow meal out of whatever simple beans or scraps are sitting forgotten in the back of your pantry. Sit down with the people you love, turn off every single television and phone, and just listen to each other's voices. Remember what it feels like to be self-reliant. Tell me in the comments below, what is the one frugal habit or piece of wisdom your grandparents passed down that you still keep alive today? Hit subscribe, and let us keep remembering the old ways together.